So on my channel, and on a lot of channels in general, we talk about past players who would dominate if you brought them to this present era. But what about the inverse? Who are the modern NBA stars who would make the biggest leaps forward if you dropped them in the 1980s? Today, I'm doing my best to answer that. Now, just to clarify, I'm not suggesting that these players would go to the 80s and just dominate to the point where guys like Bird and Magic couldn't hang. I'm just suggesting that they would dominate alongside of those guys and give them legitimate competition. Hope that makes sense, so let's get started with my list. Number 5, Giannis. At his size, with his speed, strength, and athleticism, he would be an absolute force in any era, but especially in the 80s. Something I'll mention a lot in this video is the 1980s insane pace of play. Transition basketball was a point of emphasis for most teams in the league, and there was a couple reasons for this. For one, we were still at the point in history where a transition layup or dunk attempt was seen as the most valuable shot opportunity. The other thing is that it was simply dictated by the type of point guards who generally ran the floor. Guys like Magic Johnson, Isaiah Thomas, Lafayette Lever, Mark Price, and Maurice Cheeks are just several examples of point guards who really liked to push the tempo in that era. As inflated as scoring is in the modern NBA, that has to do more with the increased volume of three-point shots. A great example of that is how the current NBA is averaging less possessions than every single season of the 1980s decade. This up-tempo basketball would suit Giannis' skill set, as he's not a great three-point shooter, but he would certainly love more opportunities to score in transition, thanks to his length, speed, and his remarkably large stride. As much as I love that hypothetical situation, there are a couple of aspects that keep him from moving any higher than the 5th spot. For one, the flagrant foul basically didn't exist throughout the 1980s, so defenses would get their money's worth and really punish the offensive player. Giannis is not a good free throw shooter, and they would make him earn his points at the free throw line. For goodness sake, they were basically assaulting Michael Jordan in the 1980s, and he was a good free throw shooter. So imagine what they do to a bad one like Giannis. The other aspect that would be difficult for the Greek Freak is the fact that they typically call traveling a lot more strictly in the 1980s, and Giannis is one of the most frequent offenders of getting away with extra steps, and there would be a few more turnovers to be had here and there. But ultimately, an era that focuses less on threes and more on easy transition baskets would be more of a gain than a loss for Giannis. Number 4, Kevin Durant. The player who scored the most points in the entirety of the 1980s decade was none other than the lengthy mid-range specialist Alex English. Now imagine a bigger version of English equipped with a lethal three-point shot. And that's essentially what you have in Kevin Durant. KD would be an absolute bucket-getting machine in the 1980s, and with his skills, I have no question that he would have regularly been the league's leading scorer. Now, I can already hear some people saying that Durant's skinny body would get snapped in the 80s, but I disagree, as there were plenty of skinny, unmuscular players who had plenty of success in the 80s. And almost none of them were as perimeter-oriented as Kevin Durant. His one-on-one skills would excel tremendously, seeing how the 80s focused on more man-to-man defense, since zone defense was illegal at that point. Let's be real, as a solid free throw shooter, mid-range shooter, and three-point shooter who happens to be 7 feet tall, I'm pretty sure that KD could dominate offensively in just about any era. But with a lot more isolation situations, I see this as an era where he would be salivating at the opportunities. Number 3, Joel Embiid. Obviously, Embiid is going to experience many of the same perks that Kevin Durant would in the 1980s, as he's a large player who's an incredibly skilled individual offensively. With less three-pointers attempted on a league-wide level, Embiid's value as a rim protector would increase dramatically, and he would likely see a huge increase to his block shots average, since way more shots were taken close to the basket. Even Embiid's value as a three-point shooter would be appreciated in that era. You had some bigs in the 80s who would occasionally stretch the floor and hit shots from three-point range. Guys like Bill Laimbeer, Manute Bol, and Jack Sikma would all do that decently often. But none of those players have the MVP caliber talent that Embiid does. And from that perspective, he would have been viewed as a jaw-dropping unicorn, which only would have helped his case for MVP consideration on a yearly basis. With his solid footwork, with his sound fundamentals, and with his terrific post moves, his game doesn't really have to change that much in 80s basketball. But due to his ability to hit shots from anywhere on the court, he would be considered as an even more legendary and special player in that era. Number 2, Nikola Jokic. Yes, I do believe that arguably the best player in the game today would be even better in the 1980s. So much of the game today is influenced by an excessive amount of dribbling and constant driving and kicking out. On the other hand, the 80s were not big on isolation basketball or on three-point shooting, but it put a greater emphasis on finding the open man and keeping the ball moving. This would have been a perfect era for the Joker, as he would have blended right in with that team-oriented style. Additionally, as I've mentioned several times in this video, 80s teams generally like to push the tempo, and oftentimes it's the rebounder who was getting the fast break started with his outlet passes, and Jokic is arguably the greatest outlet passer in NBA history. When the game slowed down, he'd be just as lethal distributing from the post. His assists per game numbers are already historically impressive in the modern NBA, but in the 80s setting, they'd be even better. As a guy who could do it all, and as a guy who was a constant triple-double threat, he would have joined the Magic and Bird rivalry and turned it into a rivalry triangle, as he's basically a chip off the same block in terms of team-first playstyles. Number 1, Victor Wembanyama. Some of you are probably asking yourselves, did Johnny really just put a skinny rookie in the number 1 spot? Yes, I did, and I feel very confident about it. Simply put, Wemby was born in the wrong era for his particular skill set to truly shine, especially on the defensive end of the floor. In only his debut season, this 7'5" tower is a Defensive Player of the Year candidate, as his rim protection is already turning heads. In the last 15 years, only 4 players have averaged more than 3 blocks over the course of a season, and Wemby is one of them, regardless of the fact that he's playing fewer than 30 minutes per game. At the time I'm making this video, Victor is averaging nearly 21 points, over 10 rebounds, a whopping 3.4 blocks, and 1.3 steals in only 28.9 minutes of action. That's insanely impressive in the modern game. But in the 1980s, that would go even further. Although scoring is inflated in the modern NBA, blocks are certainly deflated for the modern big man, and here's why. The league basically shot the same amount of field goal attempts per game, but more specifically, they were also shooting a small fraction of threes compared to what they're taking today. In 1985, 7'4" Mark Eaton set the NBA record by averaging 5.6 blocks per game, and that year, the average team was only attempting 3.1 three-point attempts per game. In this current year, the average team is attempting 35 a game. That means that the average NBA game today has roughly 60 more shots from the perimeter compared to 1985. That's an additional 64 shots that a guy like Wemby won't have a shot at contesting. In that era, even Manute Bol averaged 5 blocks per game in his rookie season, and he could barely move. If you drop Victor Wembanyama in the 1980s, where more shots are taken close to the basket, as a 7'5" player with an 8-foot-long wingspan who has the agility and quickness that guys like Manute Bol and Mark Eaton can only dream of, then I honestly think that Wemby would average 7 to 8 blocks per game, even in his limited minutes. With that kind of insane defensive production, he would be quickly entering the conversation of the greatest defenders of all time, before he's even reached his legal drinking age. Add on the fact that he's a tremendously skilled big in transition, with a great handle and a great change of pace, and yeah, he would be pretty scary on offense too in that extremely fast-paced era. Normally, I would have a list of honorable mentions, but I decided to mix it up today and show my editor's picks of his own top 5 list. What does your top 5 look like? I look forward to hearing your selections in the comment section below. Thanks for watching as always. Make sure to like and subscribe for more basketball content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.